In this video, I'm going to explain the difference between dividends and interests. Dividends are linked to shares. Interests are linked to a loan that the company will take from, for example, the bank. On one side of that slide here, you have a share, and on the other side, this picture represents the loan that the company will take from the bank. In the case of a shareholder, if I am a shareholder, that means that I have purchased a share of a company. That means that I have invested money in a company. I become the shareholder, the owner of a tiny portion of that company. This is the meaning of a shareholder. The shareholder is the owner of a company. A creditor is, in the following picture, you see it here, is, for example, the bank, is in that case an institution that has lent money to the company. The creditor, the bank, is not an owner of the company, is not a shareholder. Shareholders are not creditors. Shareholders have several rights. The first right of a shareholder, of an investor, when you invest money in a company, you believe in the future of that company, that means that you expect to receive dividends. A dividend is a portion of the profit that the company makes. A portion of that profit is distributed to the investors, to the shareholders, under the form of dividend. This dividend fluctuates. If the company is having a good year, the dividend will increase. If the company is experiencing a difficult year, then the dividend is expected to decrease. So for example, let me just illustrate this with an example taken from the outside world, from the real world. Swatch in 2020 had a very difficult year because of COVID-19. For the first time since 1983, it has made losses. So the dividend decreased in 2020 to 3.50 compared to the previous year, where the dividend per share was 5.50. So it's a huge drop in the dividend, and this is feasible, this is possible because the dividend is something which is not fixed, which is variable. So according to the situation, the dividend can increase or decrease. If I'm a shareholder of Swatch or any corporation, not only do I expect dividends at the end of each year, but I expect as well to go to the annual shareholders meeting, where all the shareholders, they get together in order to vote. Each share will bring a voting right. So I will go to the annual meetings and vote in favor or against a suggestion which is made by the board of directors. And how are the decisions made in a corporation? The majority of the shares. So the majority of the shares means is 50% of the shares plus one share. So this is, if you have the majority of the shares, that means that you can decide whatever you want for that company. So you have voting rights when you have a share. One share, one voting right. If the dividend per share, like for Swatch in 2020, is 3.50, that means that if I own 10 shares of Swatch, I will receive 10 times the dividend of 3.50. I would receive 35 francs for my 10 shares. If I have 10 shares, I have 10 voting rights, which is not a lot, obviously, in a publicly held corporation like Swatch, where you have billions of shares which are circulating. In the case of a creditor, here if I'm talking about the bank, so when do I have to deal with a creditor? When I take a loan, when I borrow money from my creditor. If I am in the shoes of the company will be the debtor. The company borrows money from the creditor, the bank. In the case of a loan, we don't talk about dividends anymore, we talk about interests. And interests are paid on a regular basis, every month, every 3 months, every year. And interests are fixed. It's not something that fluctuates according to what happens in the real world. So interest is fixed. Let me show you one more time this concept of interest here. You have me borrowing money from the bank. So I'm called the debtor. You have the bank, which is the institution here, the organization that lends money to the debtor, who's called the creditor. You have the arrow here that represents the capital. The bank lends me that amount of money. And for me to be able to dispose of that amount of money, I'm going to pay an interest on a regular basis to the bank. This arrow here represents the interest that I'm going to pay to my creditor if I'm in the shoes of my debtor. So the interest is paid by the debtor to the creditor, and it depends. If I'm in the shoes of the creditor, then I will receive the interest from the debtor. The interest is considered an interest revenue. If I put myself in the shoes of the debtor, the interest that the debtor has to pay to the creditor, the interests are seen as interest expenses. So the same interest can be seen as a revenue in the shoes of the creditor or as expenses if you place yourself in the shoes of the debtor. What you need to remember, one more thing, is that interests are fixed and dividends are variable. They will fluctuate depending on how good the situation is for the company.